Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. It is time for our 9th annual guest list episode of the Virtual Memories Show. For the guest list, I ask the past year's podcast guests to tell us about the favorite book they read in the past year. It doesn't have to be something published in 2021, just something they read and loved. Some of them also told me about which books or authors they hope to read in 2022. Now, in past years, I like to get this episode out to you guys with a couple of weeks before the holidays so it can inspire some book buying ideas and New Year's reading resolutions and otherwise give you something to look forward to while the days are getting shorter. But given the ongoing logistics, supply chain, and shipping delays, I'm frankly not as concerned about giving you time to order stuff before Christmas. And given the wave of COVID infections walloping the planet right now with the current variant, this episode it's an attempt at celebrating something. In this case, celebrating the books that brought people joy or changed their lives in some way in the past year, and that I hope can have that effect on someone else. Some of us are also celebrating the books we hope to read next year, and just that whole notion of possibility is a lot different now for the world and for me. So I don't want to get too mawkish or anything. I'll just say I'm glad you're listening, and I hope you read some good stuff last year and that you find some good books next year, and maybe this episode inspires you with a couple of titles. So, 29 of 2021's guests responded to this year's invite, which is a pretty good response rate, although I will still drag the guests who didn't deliver in private emails. I don't give too much of an intro to the guests, so I hope you'll look up this episode on the website and see the roster in our archives. If you visit either chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com, you'll find a link to the guest list 2021, and that has links to just about all the books or authors mentioned this time around, as well as links to each guest's episode. And while you're there, you can also find links to all the past editions of the guest list and maybe get some good ideas from there. And if you are interested in my favorite reads from the past year and my 2022 aspirations, I'll tell you those at the end. I haven't recorded that yet. It's something I'm still trying to think about. So let's get started. First up is longtime multiple guest Dimitri Samarov, whose new book is Old Style, which you can find on his website. There'll be a link to that in the show and episode notes for this one. Dimitri first posts the books he reviewed. An Alphabet for Joanna by Damian Rogers. He writes a poetic memoir about her relationship with her mother as dementia takes the mother's mind. Running the Light by Sam Talent. A novel about a vulgar road comic's last tour with a cameo by Norm Macdonald. Faux Pas by Amy Silman. It's rare that painters can write, Dimitri says, but Silman sure as hell can. The book collects some of her essays about art. And The Most Fun Thing by Kyle Beachy. How Beachy made me care about skateboarding, I still don't know, but he's made a whole way of life/philosophy out of it, and while I read this book, he made me believe there was something to it, too. An amazing trick. Now, for books that Dimitri read, A Fan's Notes by Frederick Exley. One of those quote-unquote legendary books I'd avoided for decades and shouldn't have. Its rep is deserved. Maybe the most accurate evocation of the addicted mentality I've ever read. Collected Stories by Bree Stidge Pancake. Another writer I'd avoided, Dimitri writes, this one mostly because of his put-on-sounding name. Great short stories about country people by someone who lived it, though for a very short life. And J.R. by William Gaddis. Reading it slowly for a third time in between other books throughout the year. one of my all-time favorites, a masterful cacophony of very American voices and a brutal takedown of this country's essence. For 2022, he writes, "Don't know what I'm reading next year as I never plan too far ahead. One book seems to lead to the next by logic that's often unknown to me, except in retrospect." Up next is Anne Catanio, author of The Art of Dramaturgy. She writes, "My favorite books that I read in 2021. First of all, has there ever been a year when we've read so much? Normally I have a job. In 2021, I had a work-from-home job with far less to do, since Lincoln Center Theater was closed for almost the entire year and rehearsals and performances were suspended. And all I wanted was my mind to leave the realities of life in Midtown New York City. So this task you've given us is hard because not only were there so many books this year for me to choose from, but because my mind and memory both are so diminished after a year in lockdown that I had a hard time remembering them all. Luckily, I have a husband with a great memory. But you didn't love that one," he says. So, first, Madison Smart Bell's Child of Light, a biography of Robert Stone. Bell was a student and afterwards friend of Stone's until the end of Stone's life, and what a life it was. His childhood in utter poverty in New York City with a single mother, sleeping on the streets at times, through the whole Wallace-Stegner California idyll in the 1960s at Stanford, in the all-time group that included Ken Kesey and Larry McMurtry, through a superstar writing career of torment and triumph, a great marriage, travels, and torturous battles with drink and drugs. This book has it all, and it's all told by a biographer who is himself such a significant writer, and who understands the toll writing can take on a person of sensibility with an appetite for life. A chronicle of an age. Next, she writes, Svetlana Alexeyevich, the Belarusian 2015 Nobel Prize winner's Last Witnesses, an oral history of the children of World War II. This book is absolutely incredible, and a reader will understand at once why Alexeyevich was awarded the Nobel, if her other work is not known to them. Last Witnesses is a book of some size, comprising dozens and dozens of very short chapters, monologues she recorded and transcribed of very old Eastern European Holocaust survivors, mostly, but not all Jewish, with fading or little memory, some of whom are remembering things at the very end of their lives they've never spoken about before, or, as happens, remembering things for the very first time as their lives come to an end. They are asked simply to relate their very first memory. Most of these memories are from the 1940s when they were children between the ages of 4 and 10. What they recall in these brief descriptions is literally unbelievable. Surreal, dreamlike, beyond comprehension, often specifically because it is a child recalling and trying to make sense of events of such extremity. Today as well, these memories challenge the comprehension of the modern reader with all that we, unfortunately, now know. A totally emotional experience, and one that had never been recorded before. Also interesting is how well represented non-Jewish partisan families are. In the West, we know less of their experiences. What does she plan on reading in 2022? She writes, "That's easy. I've cooked hundreds of dinners over the last 2 years, and so has my husband. We're sick of our family recipes, so I'm only going to buy, borrow, or download Kindle cookbooks. I need a change." And now, an audio submission by Dash Shaw, whose most recent book is Discipline.
My absolute favorite new book that I read this year was Rachel Cusk's Second Place, and I loved her outline trilogy, and I just wondered where she was going to go from there, because it felt like she had, as she put it, turned the novel inside out the way you would turn out a jacket, a windbreaker. And somehow she did it with this book. She moved on to new territory. It felt like the people were almost like tarot cards that were in an arrangement that kind of created all of these mysterious relationships between the characters, and people were at once symbolic and specific, and I just was totally mesmerized, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since reading it. And the kind of comic or art book that came out this year that I really loved was Jaime Hernandez's Queen of the Ring, his book of wrestler drawings. I've looked at that a lot. And next year, I'm very excited about China Mieville's book on the Communist Manifesto. If people know his the lectures he's given, they're on YouTube. They're always really entertaining and smart. And so I'm excited to see a whole book, a nonfiction book by him on that subject.
Up next is Anahid Narcessian, author of Keats's Odes, A Lover's Discourse. She writes, "It's time for love in the time of dollar store cutlery." So says Rosie Stockton in Permanent Volta, their debut collection of poetry out this past May from Nightboat Books. Full disclosure, I met Stockton when they were a student in my graduate seminar, but I would be captivated by this book even if it had been written by a complete stranger. Sexy, funny, tender, these poems are so effortlessly vulnerable they turn frankness into flirtation, moving with a light but no less self-assured touch between political critique and erotic longing. Stockton's lines build slowly and sweetly, wrapping around familiar lyric tropes of bondage and subjection with a sinuous ease that makes them seem bright and new and often hilarious. Quote, autonomous bottom seeking non-sovereign top. What I most admire about Permanent Volta is that it's real love poetry, as knee-deep as any of us in the muck of economic and ecological crisis, but determined to make a place for itself all the same. So many writers on the left treat sex and intimacy ironically or with a sort of censorious disgust. Stockton's over it. Kind and clever, large-hearted and droll, they're the Frank O'Hara we need for the years we just had. So, for 2022, she writes, there's a pile of books in my living room that's been getting taller and taller since I had a baby at the end of March. These days, I'm lucky if I read anything beyond Beverly Cleary's Ramona series, which my daughter loves, and the board books my son mainly likes to chew on. But if I can get to anything next year, it'll be Renee Gladman's Plans for Sentences, due May 2022 from Wave Books. I don't know much about it yet, other than it combines word and image in the way of Gladman's prose architectures and one long black sentence, co-authored with Fred Moten. But if Gladman copied out the phone book, I would happily spend the day with it. Her 2016 book, Calamities, changed the way I write. Everyone should read it while waiting for what she does next. Our next guest is Heather Cass White, author of Books Promiscuously Read. She writes, I read a lot of good books in 2021, books I enjoyed, from which I learned, that filled in missing pieces and helped me better enjoy other books. But what I'm always looking for in my reading is enchantment, a total and lasting takeover of my mind, an absorption that I can't resist. In that respect, I had two extraordinary experiences. Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellmann. It's easy to put people off reading this novel. All I have to do is mention its length, 988 pages, and describe its style, stream of consciousness including no actual sentence breaks. So I usually never do. Instead I say, and mean it, aware of and disregarding all the caveats that have to attend such a statement, that if you want to know something about being female in America at the beginning of the 21st century, you should read this book. Ellmann takes the reader inside the mind of a mother of four, living in Ohio, barely making ends meet with her academic husband. And within pages we know her in our bones, and we also begin to know the entire American history of masculine violence that has made her world. Doesn't that sound like fun? It isn't, but also it is, because Ellmann is a sorceress, and I have no idea at all how she wrote such a book. Also, Heather writes, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Ever since reading Clarke's first novel, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, in 2004, I waited painfully for another. That book inhabited me, elated me, delighted me. I read it over and over. If you haven't read it, it's another doorstopper. 800 or so pages of flawless pseudo-19th century prose about an alternate England in which magic is a real element of national history. I was hardly the only person to find it gobsmacking. Clarke won awards, sold well, earned a legion of fans, everything you could want for a great writer. And then she went dark. Nothing for years and years. Until in 2020, she published Piranesi, a slim, 245-page story about, well, you just kind of have to read it. It's hard to imagine a novel less like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and it is somehow even more powerfully haunting. Everyone I know who has read it has had the same experience of living in its world for weeks after finishing it. The first thing I did after finishing it was read it again. I suspect I'll be doing that for years to come. Up next is Robert Mccrum, author of Shakespearean. His favorite book of 2021? Burning Boy, The Life and Work of Stephen Crane by Paul Oster. Like a lot of outsiders to American fiction, I've known Crane as the author of The Red Badge of Courage, who died tragically young at 28, as it happens in England. Oster not only tells a story of Crane's remarkable life, as it were, from the inside as a fellow novelist, but also argues for Crane's influential greatness in the American canon, with a brilliant account of his short stories, novellas, and reportage, described with vivid insight, mercifully free of lit-crit jargon and academic ease. He gives us back Crane as a true modern, and one of us, a masterpiece. For 2022, he writes, "During the first UK lockdown, I devoted 2 or 3 hours a day, usually during the long afternoons, reading and rereading a book I thought I knew, but had never devoted myself to completely. In Search of Lost Time, by Marcel Proust, translated by Scott Moncrief and revised by Kilmartin and Enright. I became so addicted that now, with new restrictions looming here in the near future, I'm going to do it all again, knowing for sure that these labyrinthine, enchanting novels will be the uplifting, often wonderfully comic, antidote to this age of dread." Glenn Head, author of Chartwell Manor, is our next guest. "There are 2 books I'm going to list here that really knocked me out," he writes. The first is entitled The Art of Time in the Memoir, Then Again, by Sven Berkertz. This is by far the best book I've read about the memoir, just incredibly insightful about how the quality of a memoir is directly related to the author's approach towards time in telling one's story. It's about a lot of other things, too, and it dissects many of the memoirs it also recommends. A great book for anyone interested in the genre. The second book is Autobiography of a Face by Lucy Greeley, the story of a young woman and her struggle with cancer of the jaw. This book is amazing. One of the best memoirs I've ever read. The writing is extraordinary, and it's funny where you wouldn't expect it to be. Anyone thinking, sounds like a drag, depressing, I get it, but really, it's not. It is a wonderful book. Trust me, you won't be disappointed with Autobiography of a Face. The next book I plan to read is called Dance Nation by Claire Barron. It was a play I saw off-Broadway a few years ago, and it blew me away. All-woman cast, different ages, depicting their life experiences. I don't expect it to be as good as watching the play, but who knows? Up next is Sophia Glock, whose most recent book is Passport. For 2021, she writes, I'll choose 2 books, 1 prose, 1 comics. Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin is hands down the best novel I read in 2021. I read it sick in bed while struggling to take care of my actual real babies, and that was somehow both the worst and best way to experience Ira Levin's masterpiece. And speaking of visceral thrills, my second choice is Crisis Zone, which is quite simply a force of nature all its own. Simon Hanselman somehow outdid himself, and I recommend it to anyone who wishes to re-experience the chaos of 2020, but funnier and better drawn. For 2022, she writes, would it be totally basic of me to promise that this is the year I finally read Dostoevsky? I've never read Crime and Punishment because it seems too punishing a read for winter, and by the time summer rolls around, I'd rather not. Otherwise, I have a pile of New Yorkers that I'm sure I'll finally finish in 2022. Up next is Jonathan Bayless, who called into my Google Voice number to leave his recording. His ongoing project is the autobiographical comic series Sew Buttons.
Hey, Gil. Jonathan Bayless here, giving you a call. Wanted to respond to your best of. So, believe it or not, I have not read Love and Rockets. I tried many years ago, but I started from the beginning, and the mechanic dinosaur thing didn't really do it for me, and I stopped, which clearly was a mistake. This year, I made it my mission to read Jaime's Locas stories, and I tracked down all those big numbered Santa trades and read those, and then bought that brick of a Locas 2-book, and I finally finished that. By the end of all of that, something really special clicked in me, and I'm really looking forward to the newer stuff with Love Bunglers and beyond. But, this was a Jaime Hernandez year for me. Next year, I need to catch up on all of this year's stuff. I have a million mini comics to read, But in longer form, I want to tackle Mimi Pond's Diner sequel, The Customer is Always Wrong. Durf's Kent State, I want to that's going to be a whole thing where I want nobody around me and I want the whiskey and I'm going to read that thing. I want to read everything of Kyla Roberts' work that I haven't read. I feel like I've only read one of her collections and I want to read everything else. And there's a couple of Kramer's ergots that I'm behind on, and I found those, and those are little morsels because they're all short stories. And I have that Alison Bechtel book, which I'm sure I'm going to enjoy that more than her other stuff because I kind of prefer the Dykes work to the heavier stuff that everyone else loves. Anyway, there it is. That's what I like. Talk to you later. Bye.
Up next is Jacques Berlinerblau, author of The Philip Roth We Don't Know. The revelation in 2020/21 was Jean Toomer's Cain. Might be Jean Toomer, Jean. I'm so sorry. This is Gil, not Jacques. I may have mispronounced that. Anyway, he writes, I'm embarrassed I had not read it sooner. Really embarrassed. Anyhow, that prose evokes mood. Very few writers, any artist actually, can do that. In terms of form, the work is quirky. On the level of the sentence, it is just sublime. The authorial voice is godly, at least the type of God I'd like to worship. I hope to read a writer in 2022, long dead or almost dead, whom I've never heard of before that year. And then I hope to say, I can't believe I never heard of this author. I hope to feel ignorant for not knowing about this writer and then finding someone who I previously disliked who knows a lot about the artist in question. Then I'll reassess the person I once disliked, conceding they have virtues and prescience I never recognized. God, it sounds like Jacques leads a very complicated life. I'm glad it didn't go into academia. Anyway, our next guest is Kate Marayama, whose most recent novella is Family Solstice. She writes, I love this question because it makes me look back on what I've read this year. Working backwards, I loved the letters of Shirley Jackson. It was like having Jackson as a friend for the entire fall. She was also a working writer mom. She had a fabulous sense of humor and a genuine regard for her kids as who they were as individual humans, which makes me hate the movie Shirley even more. Her letters were a newsy, readable delight, which I dip into every morning with coffee before getting to work on my own. It was so comforting to know that even after so much success, she was lost in the woods with We Have Always Lived in the Castle. She suffered all the fraud complexes most writers have in the middle of a draft, put the book down, almost giving up on it, and went on to finish it. It was the only book of hers ever nominated for a National Book Award. The letters were not only galvanizing, if a bit heartbreaking, don't get me started on Stanley, but they made me feel a bit like I was visiting with my mom, who was a huge fan and had a similar practicality to parenting and writing. Kate writes, I also really enjoyed Katrina Ward's The Last House on Needless Street, which went so very dark, so very quickly, it scared the crap out of me and ended up leaving me hopeful and teary. She's a master of the genre, and people who should mention her name as much as some male writers who get named on the daily. I'm looking forward to Sundial. Stephen Graham Jones' The Only Good Indians was beautifully wrought and wrecked me too. I finally read Thomas Old Huvelt's Hex, which definitely crept up on me and wowed me. He's a delightful human, so it was extra fun. And for non-genre, I loved The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett and Ed Lynn's hilarious David Tung Can't Have a Girlfriend Until He Gets into an Ivy League College, which nails the yearnings and everyday awkward magic of teen years better than anything I've read yet. This was the first year in a few I wasn't reading for the Jackson Awards, so I read broadly and widely, which was kind of a joy. I intend to go into 2022 with the same abandon. Happy New Year! Now, Robert Emmett Mahar is our next guest. He's a former college professor of mine and the author of Albert Camus and the Human Crisis. He writes, favorite books read recently? Kelly Denton Borhaus' And Then Your Soul Is Gone, Moral Injury and U.S. War Culture. He doesn't give descriptions for any of these, just the titles. Edward K. Kaplan's Holiness in Words, Abraham Joshua Heschel's Politics of Piety, William Carlos Williams' The Doctor Stories, Tahar Ben Jaloun's This Blinding Absence of Light, Nicholas Wright's A Human Being Died That Night, and Helen Prejean's River of Fire. For 2022, he hopes to read Stefan Zweig's chess story, which is a way of him trying to get on my good side, N.J. Allen's Arjuna Odysseus, Shared Heritage in Indian and Greek Epic, and Edward Tick's Coming Home in Vietnam, poems. Next is Ed Sorel, whose new memoir is called Profusely Illustrated. He says 2021's fave is Lives of the Novelists by John Sutherland. For 2022, he writes, no plans for more books, but I'll continue to write and draw the literati feature in the New York Times Book Review. Zoe Belloff is our next guest. She has, her most recent books are Reminiscences of a Refugee Childhood and Parade of the Old New. This one's a little long, but I love the whole write-up, so here it is. It's just one book, too. Walker Evans, The Magazine Work by David Campani, published by Steidl in 2014. She writes, this book inspires me on so many levels. Quite simply, it presents the layouts combining photographs and texts that Walker Evans created for a variety of magazines from the 1930s through the 1960s, most notably Fortune. In fact, I was so inspired that I purchased quite a number of the original Fortune magazines on eBay so I could see his work in context. Walker Evans shows that it was possible to create art that was both formally original and speaks to a popular audience without compromise. Indeed, I think that the way in which he juxtaposes photographs and text often make his ideas resonate more strongly than the same images, framed one by one and hung on a gallery wall, where they become solitary aesthetic experiences rather than dynamic cinematic stories about this country and the people in it. Making art that was both accessible and radical was the ambition of so many great artists in the first half of the 20th century. It's an idea that really needs to be reanimated today. Amazingly, it seems now, other left artists also worked for Fortune, like Philip Guston, Jacob Lawrence, Ben Shahn, and of course James Agee, who forged such a productive relationship with Evans. Their work was jammed up next to photographs of the stuffed shirts in boardrooms of America and advertisements for industrial lubricants. They grumbled about having to work for a business publication, and sometimes their best projects were rejected, but it paid the bills, and it gave them a great platform. Sometimes the assignment was just the kick in the pants that they needed. Let us now praise Famous Men started as a project for Fortune and ended someplace very different. Here in Campani's book, we can see an earlier collaboration, 6 Days at Sea, a photo-text piece on a cruise to Cuba with Agee's sardonic and hilarious commentary. Quote, the head waiter, a prim Arthur Treacher type, conveyed his guests to their tables with the Etonian trained gestures of a sandhill crane in flight. His snobbishness rather flattered some of the customers. That's from Fortune, September 1937. From Walker Evans' magazine work, I've learned so much about how to juxtapose color and black and white images and about graphic layout. Evans photographed things and people to tell the story of this country, not from the perspective of the boardroom, but from that of the working people, and he shows that everyday things, useful things, are also beautiful. I'm thinking particularly of Beauties of the Common Tool from Fortune, July 1956, The Pitch Direct, Fortune, October 1958, and a portfolio of goods that shops put out front, like mops, buckets, and cut-price shoes, and Labor Anonymous, a series of photographs of workers in downtown Detroit, each a character caught by his camera walking past a concrete wall. Fortune, November 1946. These inspired my current project, The Song of the Essential Worker. I'm not a photographer, but through film and posters and public paintings, I aim to give today's workers a platform to tell their stories. Walker Evans did many projects on industry and infrastructure that was on the verge of destruction or consigned to obsolescence. Before They Disappear, Fortune, March 1957, is a documentary of the amazing insignias that were painted on the sides of freight train cars. Photo after photo goes by as one turns the pages, just like a train moving past us. There's the Auto Junkyard, Fortune, April 1962, with photos as faded as the cars themselves. His focus on the industrial landscapes captured by his camera brings to my mind the words of Walter Benjamin, quote, illuminated at the very moment of their disappearance. Benjamin was discussing the Paris arcades, the heart of his own unfinished, strawling Passagen work. In a very different way, he, like Evans, was trying to understand the transformation written by capitalism and industry from its roots in the 19th century. They both loved Paris and the works of Eugene Atget. They both created great unfinished works, Benjamin on file cards and Evans in the pages of popular magazines. So yeah, kind of long, but I had to read the whole thing. Thank you so much, Zoe. Up next is Carl Stevens, whose most recent book is Penny, a memoir of his cat. Prose books, he writes, Superhost by Kate Russo, David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, and Lurkers by Sandy Tan. For comics, My Begging Chart by Kyler Roberts and Crisis Zone by Simon Hanselman. Next year, he says, I'm looking forward to reading Orlando by Virginia Woolf, as recommended by Summer Pierre. Elizabeth Lash Quinn is our next guest. Her most recent book is Ars Vitae.
Greetings to you and your listeners, Gil. I read Phoenix by David Stuttard on Athens' rise before its golden age, through the lives of Miltiades, the hero of the Battle of Marathon, and Cimon, a leader before Pericles. It's a gripping nonfiction account. That was one of the great highlights of last year's readings. I also enjoyed Barbara Pym's Quartet in Autumn, about 4 unassuming office co-workers who seem from the outside to have uneventful lives, even boring-looking lives, and turn out to have rich inner lives and hidden mysteries. So that was wonderful. I finally got to read Camus' Myth of Sisyphus after meaning to for some time, and that's just life-changing. And I read George Steiner's Real Presences, a delightful way of looking at literature. I read a few other things that stand out, like Donald Robertson's How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, The Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, because I was reading a new translation of Meditations and other translations as well, older ones. And so what else? In terms of things I'm looking forward to, I had heard about Ian Bostridge's Schubert's Winter Journey, Anatomy of an Obsession, and I heard about that on the radio a couple of years ago and meant to read it someday, and I would very much like to read that this coming year. It's on Franz Schubert's Winterreise, and I intend on hearing the piece first as sung by other baritones as well as him, and then reading the book that he wrote all about that one piece. So that's one thing I'm really looking forward to. Also, House of Music, Raising the Kana Masons, about the musical, a very musical family with many children grown up, some of them grown up now, some playing cello, some violin, some piano, and it's an amazing family, and I want to know a little bit more about the family. I also want to read their children's book based on Camille Saint-Saëns's Carnival of the Animals, and it comes with a CD because that work was performed by the Kana Masons with Michael Morpurgo, who's the author of War Horse, with his poems. And it was this family also performed it on BBC Proms. So I'm looking forward to hearing the CD of their performance and also reading the children's book based on that. Other things that I'm looking forward to, I had read parts of the Bible before. I'm now reading through cover to cover and enjoying that gripping set of tales and philosophy and everything else imaginable, theology, of course. I am hoping to, quote, read, unquote, some Beethoven piano sonatas while seated at the piano. And I want to read this book I started called Notre Dame of Amiens, Life of the Gothic Cathedral by Stephen Murray. And it's an unbelievably detailed, beautiful examination of every aspect of that cathedral. And it's very spiritual, and I want to just savor the rest of it. I've begun it. What else? With a friend, I'm reading Georg Simmel's On Individuality and Social Forms, so I know very little about what is in store there. And I would love to read all of Jane Austen again. I don't know if that's going to be possible this coming year, but I would love to do that. So that's just a few things. So happy holidays, Gil, to you and your listeners. Thanks for asking. Bye.
Andy Watson is up next. His latest book is The Book Tour, and his favorite book in 2021. He writes, probably my fave has been a reread, Winter Garden from 1980 by Beryl Bainbridge. A very British excursion behind the Iron Curtain before the wall came down. It's very Bainbridge with romantic betrayals, lies, confusion, and mordant humor. Is there a death because many of her books feature or are preoccupied with death? Perhaps, but certainly there's a disappearance and no clear resolution. I've read several more of her novels this past year, including her first, Filthy Lucre, written when she was a teenager. It's not a very good book, but it's very good for a 14-year-old. I'm now starting on her final novel, The Girl in the Polka Dot Dress. It's the only one of hers I haven't read. After that, I'll go back and reread some more. Master Georgie, The Bottle Factory Outing, Injury Time, An Awfully Big Adventure. She's one of my favorite writers. For 2022, he writes, to continue to scratch a completist itch, I have a couple more Penelope Fitzgerald novels to read after finishing The Beginning of Spring this year. Again, I have her first and last novels remaining. She's also one of my favorite writers. Robert Aikman is new to me and genuinely unsettling. I have all of his short stories on hand. And I have a tall pile of Graham Greene casting a long shadow. Our next guest is Rosemary Steinbaum, trustee of the Newark Public Library and the Philip Roth Personal Library. She writes, Homeland Elegies by Ayad Akhtar would be my pick for the last year. It's saturated with Rothian memes. For next year, she says, I'm looking forward to reading Burning Boy, Paul Auster's recent biography of Stephen Crane. Our next guest is Kate Lacour, taxidermist and author of Vivisectionary. Gil, she writes, I know you already know that Moby Dick is my pick for 2021. I picked it up because of taxidermy, actually. Skinning and butchering animals is still new to me, and it's so incredibly physical after comics. Getting a joint out of its socket, positioning a stiff corpse, racing against rot, working knives and hooks that are slippery with fluids. I kept wondering how it was possible to butcher and render a whale that's bigger than the ship itself. With no electricity, no surface to brace the bulk against, no lighting worth a damn, no heavy machinery? Moby Dick answered all that for me, and more I don't think to wonder about in the first half, which I bet most readers skip over, she writes. But I wound up also loving the narrative about Ahab and the whale and the Pequod. It's all so messy and florid and idiosyncratic and unselfconsciously big. It's a wild ride. No plans for 2022, Kate writes, but I'd like to get my hands on American Gothic, an out-of-print pulp slasher by Robert Bloch, the author of the source novel for Psycho. Wang Pei-shin, or Pix, who has a wonderful book from Drawn and Quarterly called Let's Not Talk Anymore, offers up these three faves for 2021. A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, This Is What Inequality Looks Like by Teo Yu Yen, and Unspeakable Acts, edited by Sarah Weinman. This Is What Inequality Looks Like reveals how Singapore's capitalistic society views the poor, how supportive resources, on paper, appear to provide help for the poor, but are in reality a total nightmare to experience and wade through. I feel, particularly for my country, who has this tendency to want to present a lovely picture to others, this is writing like this matters a lot because it precisely shines a light on crucial matters that require immediate attention and care. For Unspeakable Acts, she writes, I love true crime books, and there are some chapters here that I enjoyed a lot because they highlighted the combination of human flaws and system failings that lead to pretty disastrous outcomes within the criminal justice system in the U.S. I wish there was this kind of literature in Singapore that I could get my hands on. Something that talks about crime here and how it's portrayed in the media, perhaps a more in-depth discussion of assorted crimes and the handling of it in Singapore. I'm generally drawn to characters or people that behave in such a way that invites easy judgment by others. It sort of explains my interest in the two books that I've mentioned. So A Confederacy of Dunces is a little more lighthearted compared to the other two books here, because the protagonist is absolutely insane in a hilarious way. Every thought and action that the protagonist does in the book just makes you go, no, stop it, what are you doing? It's a roller coaster. The writing's incredibly funny, and it was very sad to find out that the author's life had ended through suicide before the novel was published. For 2022, she writes, she wants to tackle The Art of Advocacy in Singapore, edited by Constance Singham and Margaret Thomas, The Influencing Machine, Brooke Gladstone on the Media, and The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. Kyler Roberts is up next. She called into my Google Voice number 2 and had some fun with that. Her new book is My Begging Chart.
Hi, Gil. This is Kyler, leaving a message about my favorite books. Whatever. I am making a deliberate effort not to look at everything as something I like or something I don't like and be more open to my non-judged experiences. So I don't have a favorite book, but I wanted to mention that I still read to Zia every other night. Scott reads the night between, so we read out loud a book together. And we read, it's Trevor Noah, Born a Crime, Stories from a South African Childhood. And that's a memoir that I started to read the adult version, and then they came out with one for younger readers, and the recommended grade level is 5 and 6. And it's full of what I would consider adult content. I don't know what they removed. Maybe it was swear words. The stories are so good, and Zia and I both loved it and laughed out loud. And also, you know, he tells a lot of heartbreaking stories. We really, really enjoyed reading that book together. And I also just absolutely love the idea of autobiography turned into something for young readers. I know that kids read my books sometimes, you know, even though they're considered for adults. There's some good background audio for you. I also really liked Penny by Carl Stevens, and I know you interviewed him. His books are so gorgeous. Like, you read them a few times, but then just, like, look at them all the time. So I have my Carl Stevens books ready to go all the time. I'm giving up reading for my New Year's resolution, so I don't have a book for 2022. Just kidding. All right. Bye. You can use this. Go ahead and use this wonderful audio for your podcast. Knock yourself out. Hi, Gail. It's Kyler again. This was even more fun than being on the podcast. I'm just going to keep calling you all day. I also wanted to say for 2022, I am going to catch up on my reading of books published by Conundrum Press. Andy Brown is a friend and has sent me his books, which is so extremely nice. And I did actually read one very recently, Fugitive Days by Veronica Post, which I really enjoyed, and I ended up bringing it into my classroom and showing them a few pages and talking about it. There's this one scene where one of the characters talks about her childhood and growing up poor and how her mom would bathe her in freezing cold water in an effort to toughen her up. And I thought that was just like such a good metaphor. I mean, it was meant sort of literally, but just like what parents do to toughen up their kids, or like how somebody toughens up at any point in their life, either deliberately or accidentally. I thought it was a really insightful moment, and funny also. All right. I'm tempted to talk until I get cut off at the 3-minute mark. I hope you're doing all right. All right. Take care. Don't run too much. Bye.
Unfortunately, Kyler, I did run too much. I'm having Achilles problems now, and it's really kind of getting to me. Might make me reread the Iliad in 2022 now that I think about it, but that's neither here nor there. Our next guest is Haywood Gould, author of Drafted, a memoir of the 60s. Haywood has 2 books for 2021. One is the Sholem Ash trilogy, The Nazarene, The Apostle, and Mary. He writes, an empathetic rendering of the Christian theogony. Written in Yiddish about Christ, St. Paul, and Mary, Mother of Christ, these novels became worldwide bestsellers when issued in English translation. Ash wanted to establish a line of continuity from Judaism to Christianity. Christians accepted this, but he was furiously condemned by leaders of the Jewish community and joined Spinoza and de Souza as one of the few Jews ever excommunicated. It was said that people crossed the street to spit in his face. No one attended his funeral in Jerusalem. Reading these compulsively readable, scrupulously accurate historical novels, it's hard to understand what inspired such vitriol. Maybe it was just jealousy. The other book is Michael Curtiz, A Life in Film by Alan K. Rode. The definitive life, work, and loves of the director of Casablanca, Mildred Pierce, Robin Hood, and scores of Hollywood hits. Starting as a circus performer in Hungary, Curtiz won early fame in the silence and rose to legendary success as Warner Brothers' #1 director. The 700 pages read like a tweet, chock full of the Hollywood anecdotes we love, plus detailed descriptions of the making of his great films. Up next is Scott Newstock, author of How to Think Like Shakespeare. Since last year seeped into this year, I hope it's not cheating for me to include titles from the outset of the pandemic. In fact, the loss of one volume marks the precise moment when the reality of COVID hit me, March 12, 2020. The previous day, I'd flown to Minnesota to attend a Guthrie Theater memorial for the poet Louis Jenkins. While there was some nervous joking in the air, everyone overcame their hesitation as we gathered to listen to Mark Rylance, Joyce Sutphin, Tyson Forbes, and other grateful artists recount their late friends' gifts. Later that evening, as old high school companions and I toasted Louis over some beers, the sports bar's TV began blaring news about the NBA shutting down. One of my friends, a physician, recited a stream of terrifying first-hand accounts from colleagues in Washington State. No wonder I left J.A. Baker's The Peregrine in the airplane seat back that next morning. I was too rattled to think about anything, much less Falcons. But I'd been enthralled by the first pages of this beguiling account, which I'd picked up on the recommendation of Werner Herzog, who called it an ecstasy of a delirious sort of love for what Baker observes. So the first thing I did upon returning home to Memphis, after panic purchasing dried beans, was to order another copy of Baker. And then my 8-year-old son and I read it aloud together, a reassuring focal point while so much seemed to unravel around us. A few months later, I encountered Zena Hitz's Lost in Thought, where I found another endorsement of the Peregrine's motto, "The hardest thing of all to see is what is really there." Zena has since launched an amazing initiative, the Catherine Project, which has gifted me with a group of perceptive fellow readers of Michel de Montaigne. As I leaf through his 107 essays across some 1,000 pages, I marvel at his conclusions. The most beautiful lives, to my mind, are those that conform to the common human pattern, with order, but without miracle and without eccentricity. So says 313 of Experience. Maybe a hopeful note for 2022. I intend to conclude reading Anna Karenina in Rosamund Bartlett's translation. As mentioned on Virtual Memories, I'm reading Tolstoy with my teenage daughter. We just finished Book 4. Halfway there. Up next is Michael Deforge, whose most recent book is Heaven, No Hell. For 2021, he writes, The Man Who Closed the Asylums by John Foote was my favorite read this year, about Franco Basaglia and the work he and his team did in the Gorizia Asylum in an attempt to reform conditions in mental institutions, with the intent of eventually abolishing them altogether. Really lovely to have a deep dive on the movement's successes and failures, and he does a good job of articulating all the different tensions between reform and revolution. 2022, he writes, honestly, no. I'm sure there are some entries in the 2022 winter and spring catalogs I'm planning to get to if I were to have them in front of me. But one of the things I missed a lot were the spontaneous discoveries that could only happen when aimlessly browsing through shelves. So I hope there can at least be a bit more of that going into the next year. Although I remain skeptical of the language around opening back up while the pandemic hasn't actually ended yet, I'm very relieved that in my city it's been possible to go back to a bookstore and be surprised by what I stumble across. Our next guest is Ron Hogan, whose most recent book is Our Endless and Proper Work. Ron writes, when I was 16 or so, I found a copy of Anthony Burgess's 99 novels in my public library and resolved to read as many as I could. This proved harder than I first thought, as several of them had already gone out of print, at least in the United States. That's not the main point. The main point is that Burgess turned me on to Robertson Davies' The Rebel Angels, and from there, while I waited for the other volumes of the Cornish trilogy to come out, I backtracked and devoured the Deptford trilogy, and Davies became one of my favorite authors. That said, it's been roughly 30 years since I've read anything by him, and I invoke him today primarily to describe the magical qualities I love about David Bentley Hart's Roland in Moonlight, which came out earlier this year. Hart's a theologian I first began reading about 4 years ago, when his translation of the New Testament was published, and whose argument in favor of universal salvation I found mightily convincing. Roland might be a memoir of his last decade, but the lengthy philosophical dialogues with his dog suggest something else is in play here. Were we to consider it fiction, we might find it lacking in a certain narrative momentum. As an imaginative exploration of some of Hart's philosophical preoccupations, however, it approaches the same synthesis of personal insight and mythical syncretism that drew me to Robertson Davies back in the day. As for 2022, Hart has 2 theological treatises coming out in the months ahead that sound equally fascinating. Tradition and Apocalypse, billed as an essay on the future of Christian belief, and You Are Gods, a treatise on nature and supernature. I shall be among the first in line to read them both. Our next guest is Jen Silverman, whose first novel is We Play Ourselves. I really love this book, and it will be at the very end of the episode when I talk about my faves from 2021. Anyway, her faves. I absolutely loved The Death of Vivek Oji by Akwaeke Emezi, and Red Pill by Hari Kunzru, which I bought for a number of friends, and Smile, The Story of a Face by Sarah Rule. I also began a Doris Lessing deep dive, which I'm still on, and which so far has been revelatory. For 2022, she wants to read Bathsheba Demuth's Floating Coast, An Environmental History of the Bering Strait, and Maggie Shipstead's The Great Circle, among others. Our next guest is Nadine Sergeyoff. She is in charge of the Philip Roth Personal Library in the Newark Public Library, but she's going to fill you in on all that.
The first question, I don't want to turn this into a long answer, but as a librarian, I feel I need to explain myself. So as a librarian, I feel compelled to read as many fiction bestsellers as I can because in addition to my position as the Philip Roth Personal Librarian at the Newark Public Library, I also have a part-time gig at the library in the town where I live on occasional weekends. So I always need to be ready in order to make reading suggestions or to recognize titles that voracious readers ask me about. The artistic side of me admires the creativity in works of fiction, though sometimes I find it difficult to stay focused, particularly when there are a lot of characters or if there are flashbacks. And honestly, some don't interest me or I just don't comprehend what people find so compelling about them. The nerd in me finds great delight in nonfiction. I enjoy learning and appreciate the amount of research that goes into these titles. But with that said, I am behind on my nonfiction list because I've been catching up on Philip Roth this year, along with the long biographies of Roth that were published in 2021 and trying to read many of the bestsellers. I particularly love history, art, and science. So I finally got to cast The Origins of Our Discontents, and I haven't been able to put it down. It's a fantastic combination of tedious research and a great writing style that just sucked me in from the first page. one learns about such unsettling and tragic aspects of the country's history, which are so astonishing one cannot comprehend how they even happened, or more incredulously, how they were promoted and persisted for so long. I find myself rereading sentences and blurting them out loud from my disbelief. In 2022, I do have a reading list, so I thoroughly enjoy The Gentleman from Moscow and plan on reading The Lincoln Highway, and I'll also get to Louise Erdrich's The Sentence. And I mentioned on catching up on nonfiction, and I recall making a reference to cookbooks in my last interview. On an uninterrupted day, I really enjoy perusing menus of high-end restaurants and then attempting to recreate those recipes. As someone who was a vegetarian for 30 years, who is now with someone who isn't, I've been trying to learn about searing and grilling techniques. And so I will be consulting some books by Anthony Bourdain. My first attempt at making a filet mignon was, much to my surprise, a great success, and my husband-to-be exclaimed that I earned more than one Michelin star that evening. So, as I mentioned before, I always love learning, and I will continue to do so with cookbooks. And agriculture also greatly piques my interests, since I did enjoy gardening when I had a backyard. So I will definitely be looking at Eating to Extinction.
We are near the end. Our second to last guest is Matt Madden, author of Ex Libris. He writes, I don't like to think in terms of favorites, but a book that really impressed me in 2021 was Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House. It's a memoir about an abusive relationship constructed as a kind of Oulipian exercise in style, where each chapter is titled Dream House as X, where X can be soap opera, slasher film, choose your own adventure, etc. It's formally inventive, which I love, as you know, but it's also heartbreaking, gut-churning, witty, and, improbably, laugh-out-loud funny. In the coming year, I hope generally to read a bit more than I did in 2021. Some of the things I look forward to reading, drawn randomly from my brain as my family noisily sets a dinner table around me, are Rutu Modin's Tunnels, Hervé Letellier's The Anomaly, which I ordered in French earlier this year before the translation became an end-of-year hit in America. I'm happy for him. And more Charles Portis and Flann O'Brien. And our last guest is Shari Flanagan, for whom a collection of her Trotz and Bonnie comics came out earlier this year. And whenever I talk about like Pantheon-level people I'm really happy to have recorded with, Shari is among them. I'm so happy I got to record with her, and I'm so happy Trotz and Bonnie came out this year in a big collection. Anyway, she writes, I mostly listen to audiobooks while walking the dog. That's usually at least 90 minutes a day, so I can cover a lot of pages, even more while I'm working in the garden. This year I discovered Octavia E. Butler, got hooked by Kindred, moved on to the vast landscapes of The Parable of the Sower and The Parable of the Talents. Post-apocalyptic stories are my favorite form of escapism, and these feature strong woman protagonists. My idea of a good time. The biblical structure and uncanny political prophecies of the Parable series were added benefits. Honorable mentions are Laurie Frankel's novels Goodbye for Now, about a Seattle tech worker who invents an app that allows people to visit their deceased loved ones, and This Is How It Always Is, an amazingly gripping yet pleasant story about the challenges of raising a gender nonconforming child. Matt Haig's novel, The Midnight Library, imagines a way to go back and live the lives we regret not choosing. It's going to be a fun movie. I don't read a lot of graphic novels, she writes, but wow, Alison Bechdel's writing transcends the format. I compare it to the way the books of James Michener and Dan Brown educate while entertaining. I wonder if Bechdel has come to realize how many people have similar childhoods, dysfunctional environments that breed strong individuals with unique coping mechanisms. I read Fun Home, Are You My Mother, and The Secret to Superhuman Strength, then bought them for my best superachiever friends. I'm writing this in bed, she writes. I just woke up, and my dog is begging to go out, so that's it for now. Thank you so much for creating your great annual reading lists, and also thanks for posting your art on Instagram. I love reading your thoughts about the choices you made. Okay, I said that was the last one, but I waited overnight to post my part of the guest list, and during that time, one more came in. This is from the translator Alta Price, or A.L. Price. Because she's a translator, a lot of the names are going to be tricky, and I apologize in advance for the mangling. Her 2021 faves include Close to the Teeth by Elisa Biagini, translated by Sarah Stickney and Diana Thau from Autumn Hill Books. She writes, "This is an excellent English language version of a collection first published in Italian as La Hospite." You got me. Anyway, Exhausted on the Cross by Najwan Darwish, translated by Kareem James Abu Zaid from New York Review Books. She writes, "Pure poetry and art and agony and poetry." Next is Born in a Second Language by Okosua Zimba Afriye Hoede from Button Poetry in 2021. She writes, "I always appreciate a book that shifts its readers' perspectives by making us turn it in a different direction partway through. Also, who doesn't enjoy a good poem in the form of a flowchart?" And last for 2021, she includes Ulrat, Best Contemporary Stories in Translation from the Philippines, edited by Tilde Acuna, John Bengan, Daryl Delgado, Amado Anthony G. Mendoza III, and Christine Ong Muslim from Gowdy Boy. She writes, "One of the wildest short story collections I have read in years." For 2022, she writes, "The most recent volumes on my incoming shelf. Black Paper by Teju Cole, which I think we talk about in our recent episode. Der Termin, Milena Adams' German translation of Katharina Volkmer's The Appointment." She writes, "Because sometimes I like to see how translators working in the opposite direction handle things." She notes that Volkmer is in London, but if you keep doing these virtual interviews, you might consider having her on the show. She also adds Appropriate, A Provocation by Paisley Rekdal from W.W. Norton, Lady Joker, Volume 1 by Kaoru Takamura, translated by Allison Markin Powell and Marie Ilda from Soho Crime, and Kaya Days by Carl de Souza, translated by Jeffrey Zuckerman from Two Lines Press. And she notes that's leaving out the stuff I'm reading for work, naturally. As for me, Lord knows why I'd be interested, but when I look over 2021, here are some of the books that stick with me. I'll do prose first and then comics. Hot, Cold, Heavy, Light, 100 Art Readings from 1988 to 2018 by Peter Sheldall. Recording with Peter was one of my great podcast moments, one of my great life moments. So finishing this collection of a ton of his, 100 of his pieces on art was really meaningful for me. The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War by Louis Menand. I balked initially because it's like 800 pages long, but I pitched him on the show, and so I committed to reading the book. Turned out, A, to be compulsively readable, B, it educated me. I learned a great deal about 20th century thought and art and the personalities behind a lot of these things and the accidents that led to a lot of the developments during the Cold War era. It's a wonderful book. It may seem daunting between just the title and subject matter and the sheer heft of it, but it's an absolute joy and utterly illuminating. Ars Vitae, or Vitae, I screw up my Latin, The Fate of Inwardness and the Return of the Ancient Arts of Living by Elizabeth Lash Quinn, another book that I learned a ton from. She takes 5 schools of Greek and Roman thought, or thought of antiquity, and shows how they've woven themselves into modernity and why we're maybe pursuing some of the wrong lines of thought and what we could be doing to live better lives. Next are a couple of memoirs, Lost Property, Memoirs and Confessions of a Bad Boy by Ben Sonnenberg, and Drafted, a memoir of the 60s by Haywood Gould. 2 very different people, 2 very, very entertaining memoirs. Sonnenberg comes from this well-to-do family. It's a fascinating memoir of a guy's very dissolute life where he ends up becoming a better human being at the same time that his health begins to fail. But it's a really fascinating book. Drafted, it's a young Jew hustling, trying to keep himself out of Vietnam, just told by a master screenwriter and storyteller in Haywood Gould, it's also just compulsively readable. And I enjoy that era, that 50s into 60s New York, and Haywood captures a lot of neat aspects of it. So this one was just catnip for me. The next two actually come up a little bit later in my rant here, because they've inspired me to read other stuff. Albert Camus and the Human Crisis by Robert Emmett Mahar, and Shakespearean on Life and Language in Times of Disruption by Robert Mccrum. Both of those books have, in different ways, opened me up to the authors that they're the subject of. And that's all I'm going to say about that stuff. They're both really good books, and they could potentially open you up to reading more widely, or returning to books you should have read a long time ago, or did read a long time ago but didn't read them well. Last nonfiction is Bald, 35 Philosophical Shortcuts by Simon Critchley. We meant to get together to record for this one. Pandemic got in the way. I'm hoping to record with him next year. This is a collection of his pieces from the New York Times. They're up and down, but more up than down. And it's Simon, it's philosophy, it's soccer, it's good reading. There are only a couple of novels that stood out for me for some reason. We Play Ourselves by Jen Silverman, which felt more like the present in a way that I could digest as an old man, relatively old man. It's a novel about internet humiliation, art making, absurdism, theater, and a lot of aspects of the constructed and performative life we have versus what we try to live as an authentic self. Anyway, it's a really good novel, and I'm really happy that I got to connect with her and record a show. The other one is Empire of the Sun by Jg Ballard. David Bayerwalt, one of my past guests, turned me on to that one. I saw the movie a million years ago, but reading the novel is one of the most harrowing experiences I've ever had, but also aesthetically gorgeous. And given how much of it is real from Ballard's own experience, it's kind of, I don't want to say life-affirming, but it's a sense of, holy crap, someone experienced this as a kid and managed not just to function as a human being, but to become a world-famous, writer and artist. Anyway, Empire of the Sun, I really enjoyed, which I'd also read a few other Ballards this year, but that was the one that really jumped out for me. As comics go, Let's Not Talk Anymore by Pix, or Wang Pixin. It's strangely beautiful and a really interesting structure she uses to tell the story of 5 generations of women, each one at the age of 15. Yeah, you need to read it. It comes from Drawn and Quarterly. Let's Not Talk Anymore. My Begging Chart by Kyler Roberts. I'm a huge mark for Kyler's work, and this one captures some of the life she's currently living, and again, what it means to make art out of the day-to-day, which is sort of a preoccupation of mine. When you live in a relatively quiet suburban world, where do you find those moments of, magic and such? The last one is the book that I mentioned right near the end here, The Collection of Trots and Bonnie by Sherry Flanagan. I am ecstatic that this came out in a big collection, and it's a gorgeous physical book to read, and it's wonderful just reading all of Sherry's work in the Trots and Bonnie vein. Anyway, go get that one. It's from New York Review Books Comics. Now, keep in mind, I'm recording this on December 21st, so that means there are still 10 days left in 2021 for me. So there might be other things that would have shown up on this list had I waited until New Year's Eve. I'm about to finish Hemingway's Death in the Afternoon, and I'm going to start Wallace Willie Minozzi's Silence and Silences. I may spend most of next week reading short memoirs and essays by the dying and dead, like Oliver Sacks's Gratitude, Christopher Hitchens' Mortality, Corey Taylor's Dying, a memoir. I may keep up my Christmas tradition of reading Philip Roth's Everyman. I may veer in a completely different direction to finish the year. What I'm saying is, you never know until the very end exactly what the best books you read were. For next year, in keeping with the Memoirs of the Dying, it is tough to think about next year, what with everything that's going on. My health is probably going to be just fine when I get my blood work next month, and then 6 months after that and 6 months after that. But, you don't know. There are books I have for upcoming or prospective podcasts. That's a little different than, what I want to read in 2022, but potential podcast books I'm looking forward to include Haley Campbell's new one, All the Living and the Dead, From Embalmers to Executioners, an exploration of the people who have made death their life's work. You just have to trust me on that one. Also looking forward to Celia Paul's Letters to Gwen John, Anna Della Subin's Accidental Gods on Men Unwittingly Turned Divine, and Orwell's Roses by Rebecca Solnit. There's no guarantee I'm going to record with any of them, but their books sound great on their own. I am pitching them, so let's hope those all come together. Oh, also, Amor Towles did say he is on for a follow-up podcast, so I've got his new one, The Lincoln Highway, on my shelf. Personal reading. I should probably get to Siddhartha Mukherjee's The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer, for obvious reasons. Every year I tell myself I should get back to reading Shakespeare. Maybe this will be the year I do that, with a nudge from Robert Mccrum's wonderful Shakespearean. Same thing, Bob Mahar got me thinking I really need to read more Camus, so I've got that on the list. An artist pal suggested I read Jean Renoir's memoir about his dad, so I picked that up. The Ben Sonnenberg memoir turned me on to a novel called The Maze Maker by Michael Ayrton that fits into a novel that I will never get around to writing, so I've got that on my shelf. Maybe I'll read that and feel less bad about my own failures. One of my running pals a few weeks ago gave me a copy of Murakami's What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, and I really want to get to that one. But the thing about doing this part of the episode is that it makes me look over my shelves down here in the library and consider everything I haven't read and will never get to read. Which is to say, this part is both aspirational and a mortality check. In addition, it's also a guilt inducer, since there are a ton of books I really should have read by now, but didn't. Anyway, at the end of 2020, here's what I said I was hoping to read in 2021. The Art of the Personal Essay, and The Glorious American Essay, both edited by Philip Lopate. Hot, Cold, Heavy, Light by Peter Sheldal. Philip Roth in Memory, which is a collection of the eulogies at his memorial service. Nabokov in America by Robert Roper, and The Fire of Joy, collection of poems edited by Clive James. I read the Sheldal collection and a smattering of the 2 essay collections that Lopate edited, so all things considered, that's a better batting average than I usually post. I was probably feeling more realistic last year in anticipation of turning 50, but I didn't anticipate what 2021 would be like at all. So that is it for the 2021 edition of the Virtual Memories Show guest list. Thanks for sticking around, and thanks for listening throughout the year. This has been quite a year for me and for the world at large, and I hope the podcast helped you get through it just a little, because it's really been a lifeline for me. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.